Hi, everyone. This is Clayton from Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. I just wanted to jump in here before the episode begins and say that this will be our last episode of the year. Megan and I are going to take a little bit of a break over the Christmas season, the New Year's season. We won't be recording during those couple of weeks. And so we will be back in the middle of January for you all. All right, enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, where we take you back to the good old days, just maybe not quite how you expect.
Yeah, maybe not how you expect from our title. And Megan, what are we talking about today?
Well, today, Clayton, we are rejecting shareholder supremacy and embracing public benefits corporations.
All right, I'm familiar with the first half of this title, vaguely familiar with the second half of this title. What does that mean?
Well, what it means is we are going to move away from prioritizing shareholders and their best interests and their benefits and move towards embracing a corporate structure that can consider all of us, can consider much more than just making money for a few people who own part of a company.
Well, that sounds pretty good to me. So why don't
Right? Have I got you already? Like, let's save 45 minutes and just move on.
Yeah, I have a lot. I have a lot that I could do today. I mean,
since we've got you all here, we feel like we should give you some details. So let's talk a little bit more about this. I think a recurring theme of the podcast and also of the 2020s has been the enshittification of American life. So Clayton, can you think of a few ways that corporations have made your life worse over the last few years?
I mean, ask me to narrow it down to a few ways.
Right? Don't threaten me with a good time.
But in the interest of making the next 45 minutes of the podcast about something other than that, I'll do my best for you. So I think very clearly, I mean, there's a whole deal about airlines, right? Like there was a big snowstorm in the Pacific Northwest and sort of down through Northern California in 2022. Like my sister got stuck in Seattle. Well, like she lives in Seattle, to be clear, but she got stuck in Seattle and was not able to make it down for Christmas to visit my family. They were with the like Southwest Airlines snafu that was happening up there. Like 4 days, basically. They were like, you got to go to the airport every single day and see if your flight's taken off. And then it just never was. It never was.
Total meltdown. So my parents were also stuck in this. They got stuck coming from Hawaii to Portland. They were stuck in San Jose for a week.
What was the problem? They couldn't fly out of San Jose or they couldn't fly into Portland?
Both at a certain point.
Okay.
There was a time at which they thought they would just have to fly back to Hawaii and try again. And they wound up renting a car and driving. But that is the Southwest Airlines thing is a perfect example of this because every other airline got their act together in relatively short order. As soon as the ice melted, they were able to kind of resolve this problem. But Southwest Airlines, the issue was their scheduling and HR software, which they had not updated and required every pilot, every co-pilot, every flight attendant to call human resources and tell them where they were physically in the country. And people were on hold. I saw reports that some employees were on hold with HR for 24 hours.
Jesus.
And that was, it's the perfect example. We can come up with many more, I'm sure, but that is an example of Southwest Airlines trying to save money, not updating their HR software. But what else you got? Any other good ones?
Speaking of saving money, I thought about this. This is a more recent one. My wife and I went to Mexico on our honeymoon over the last summer. And originally we were supposed to do the first leg of the honeymoon in Cancun, which is sort of the like edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, one of the big sort of resort areas in Mexico. Like the Friday before we were supposed to leave, we got where there was going to be a hurricane that was supposed to hit Cancun the day we were supposed to arrive, which was the following Thursday, right?
Going to create some problems.
Yeah, which like the airline that we were flying on was no longer going to be flying into Cancun that day. And to their credit, Alaska Airlines gave us our money back. That was very nice of them. But we booked our hotel through Priceline, and as it turned out, Priceline would not give us our money back. Totally, like, completely refused to do it and have still refused to do it. And I've just given up at this point. Because evidently what they do is they use an intermediary. Priceline themselves does not like actually do the booking. They use an intermediary to book hotels in Mexico. And first, Priceline told us, oh, well, you would have needed to cancel a week in advance. So Thursday, the day before we actually canceled, the day before we learned there was a fucking hurricane headed for Cancun, right? And then after that, when we were like, there was a hurricane, they were like, oh, well, since we didn't actually make the booking, it would need to go through this intermediary. And the intermediary told us, oh, well, we'd need to go through the hotel. And the hotel had been hit by a hurricane. So like, so they weren't like answering the call. Yeah, right. And like then after that, we tried to dispute the charge through Wells Fargo, and like Wells Fargo wouldn't let us dispute the charge because Priceline was like, well, they didn't cancel in time, right? And so even then, after we talked to Wells Fargo and we're like, hey, they admitted that we could cancel because there was a hurricane, Wells Fargo was like, oh, well, we already resolved the dispute. You can't open another dispute on the same charge. So yeah, it kind of sucked. The enshittification of American life, it kind of sucked. Yeah. I'm out like $600. Yeah.
Over a hotel room that you never actually got to use because it's, first of all, a corporation is fighting you tooth and nail to not give you your money back. But you've also got this completely Byzantine structure where you have an intermediary for an intermediary doing the actual work, as opposed to a corporation or just going through a hotel, etc.
And so, Megan, you're telling me here that this is partly because of this shareholder supremacy. This
I am. I've got another one for you. How about this? So I bought a laptop from Best Buy, actually the laptop that we're using to record this podcast. So there is a happy ending and it does get resolved. I bought a laptop from Best Buy and I paid extra to have them transfer over all of my files from my old laptop to my new one. And they couldn't figure out how to do this for some reason. It took at least 10 days, and Best Buy has a ticketing system where you can kind of see what their Geek Squad guys are doing as they work. And the tickets, not only was it not advancing through their system, it was going backwards. I said, well, that's weird. So I call Best Buy just to see if I can go pick up my laptop. And the person on the other end of the phone is at a call center looking at the same ticketing system that I am. And so she can give me no information. But the Best Buy store on 82nd Avenue in Portland doesn't have a phone number anymore. You cannot call that store. So I wound up going physically to this store and talking to a person and saying, hey, what's the deal here? To get an answer about what was actually going on with my laptop. Because it is more efficient to centralize.
Well, more efficient, more profitable, shall we say. Yeah.
It is more efficient for the corporation Best Buy to have one phone number and one call center than to have employees in individual stores answering the phone. I want to give credit to my business organizations professor, David Friedman, who was briefly Twitter famous when people thought he was Trump's new ambassador to Israel. That was a different David Friedman. He asked us during BizOrg, he asked us, do you think calling Comcast is efficient? Comcast, legendarily bad phone tree customer service. It's a nightmare. And everybody in the room, it's like 90 students, everybody says, no, it's the worst. It sucks. Comcast is terrible. And he says, it is efficient. It is efficient for Comcast. And that's why they do it.
And that's what they care about. That's what the shareholders care about.
Nobody cares about the customer experience unless it is going to decrease profits. So you have your classic, everything is more expensive complaints. You have self-checkout that is now an excuse to not employ checkers and have checkout lanes open. You have stores not stocking merchandise anymore. In general, it seems like we are getting less while paying the same or more, and that there's nothing we can do about it. And yes, Clayton, the reason we see this monomaniacal drive to make everything worse for customers is that corporations are trying to do everything they can as cheaply as possible in order to be as profitable as possible to increase value for shareholders.
So this is where, so for those who aren't aware, maybe we should give like a bit of a definition of shareholder supremacy, shareholder primacy. My understanding, and let me know if I'm missing pieces here, and try to walk through this with the audience, is that shareholder primacy, shareholder supremacy is basically a theory in corporate governance. And in many cases, like in many states, at least, I think, like a legal mandate, right?
Yes.
That states, corporations that are incorporated in that state have their first financial obligation, their fiduciary duty, is to make money for the shareholders, and everything else has to follow from that. So if you're doing something that like the shareholders believe is bad for business and will not make them money, they can like take you to court or like vote on the board of directors and stuff and make you stop doing the things that might be good for people but are bad for shareholders.
Absolutely. That is exactly the correct nutshell way to understand this. I'm going to break this down further so our listeners, when they're having arguments over Christmas dinner, can absolutely do it with confidence. But that is the top line explanation of what is going on here, that shareholders and their value are the legal requirement that corporate officers must be pursuing the best interest for. So let's talk about really quick, what is a shareholder? Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think this episode will air after Christmas.
Dang it.
However, at your New Year's celebration.
At your New Year's celebration. All right. I tried for you guys. I did my best.
What is a shareholder?
What is a shareholder? Thank you. What is a shareholder? So a shareholder is someone with an ownership interest in a public corporation. A public or publicly traded company doesn't mean that it's owned by the government. This is a mistake that gets made, I think, pretty often on the internet.
Very often.
A publicly traded company just means that people can buy and sell shares on the open market. Shareholders can be individuals. You and I and anyone who listens to this podcast can own shares in a corporation. It can also be an institution. A pension fund can own shares in a corporation. Yes. We're going to talk about pension funds a lot as we go through this episode. Shareholders make money in one of a couple of ways. First, the value of shares change, and then they sell shares.
This is the classic buy low, sell high type thing.
Exactly. Or short selling, which still baffles me, but it's a thing that works somehow. The value of shares change, and then you sell the shares, and the value can change because the stock is perceived as more valuable. Perceived, which I strongly contend the stock market is fake because it's all about perception. Or values of shares can change through stock buybacks. A corporation can determine that it is going to buy its own shares back to kind of pull more of that ownership interest back into itself. Interestingly, in the research for this episode, I learned that this was something that was considered illegal manipulation of stock prices until the 1980s. And we trace it all back to Reagan.
Fucking Reagan is always that guy.
It's always Reagan. So that's way number one is the value of your shares change and then you sell your shares. Way number two is dividends are paid to shareholders. And this is something that can happen in a number of different corporate forms. Co-ops are famous for doing this. I think the best example of that, at least in my life in the Pacific Northwest, is REI.
I knew you were going to say REI.
I get $10 from REI basically every year. So it's kind of a shared interest in a co-op and you get that money back. If you own Apple stock and Apple decides it's paying dividends in any particular year, they will send you a check. That is more or less how that works. You don't need to sell your shares to get money out of that stock. So the next question I suppose we ask is, why do shareholders need value? Why is that a thing that corporations are worried about? And this is going to give us a little bit of legal history in addition to talking about how we got to the place that we are today. Shareholders are taking a risk. They are basically loaning a corporation money in exchange for a bit of the profit and some say over how the company makes decisions in the future. When you talk about that risk sharing, some of the first corporations were groups that got together to fund land reclamation in the Netherlands. They built the dams and dikes and windmills to pump out water. And they did that collaboratively because nobody could afford it on their own, then you have something like the Virginia company, where you are taking a risk that your ship is going to sink or your colony is going to fail, and nobody wants to be solely responsible for losing all of that money if the failure occurs. But if you have 100 people each owning 1% of that failure, it's much less burdensome to an individual to take a business risk.
Yeah, the East India Company is also a great example of this. Like, many of the first corporations were about colonization. They were
exactly, because it was, while we look back on it now and say, oh, that was such a great way to make money at the expense of indigenous peoples, obviously, it was intensely risky initially. And so to get to a point where the risk is kind of overcome requires a lot of initial investment.
Yeah, and believe it or not, most indigenous peoples were not happy about the East India Company showing up, or the Virginia Company showing up, or the Hudson's Bay Company showing up, right?
Go figure. Yeah,
and so they're like, oh, this is so risky for us, right? Yeah, absolutely. Okay,
yeah,
so the history is not starting well. Maybe it gets a little better than literal colonization.
Yes. The land reclamation in the Netherlands didn't necessarily harm people. But so you've got the exchange for taking on that risk is that you get some of the profit if there's a profit, and you get to have some say over how the company makes decisions in the future. The sorts of things that shareholders vote on are things like executive compensation, if you're going to do a stock split, if you're going to issue dividends, like we just talked about, that sort of things. So there's a possibility that the company will fail and owners will not recover their investment. In order to incentivize the investment being made in the first place, that cut of the profits carrot is really necessary to grow those corporations. The public selling of shares of corporations in the beginning was a way to spread out the risk of starting a business. It's very simple and very straightforward. But in the 1970s and 1980s, shareholder value became the dominant business model rather than retain and reinvest was the previous model of what to do with your profits.
It also seems to me like by the time that you are a publicly traded corporation, you're not really doing the there's no longer the risk of starting a new business, right? Like individual entrepreneurs, and I guess you could say maybe venture funds or whatever, right?
Yes.
In a lot of the way, they're the ones taking on that risk nowadays.
There is now a kind of venture capital industrial complex that really didn't exist at the time that these corporate forms were being envisioned and developed. So that's absolutely a great point. By the time you go public, going public is kind of the goal of an entrepreneur. And you're not really at a point where you are taking on a risk like that or really risking significant loss by then. Great point, Clayton. Totally warranted.
It's like the use case for this ownership model. It's not the same as the use case was when this form was established.
Absolutely. So the time in the 70s and 80s when shareholder value becomes this dominant business model, it made a lot of sense because many shares of corporations at that time were owned by pension funds, which really needed to make more money as more employees entitled to pensions retire. So just to give a quick example of how pensions work, because it is a rare person under 40 who really has a solid understanding of how this sort of setup works. Pensions are generally not the same as Social Security, which is a pay-as-you-go model. When you and I have Social Security taken out of our paychecks, we are giving it directly to somebody's Mima. That is happening immediately. A pension isn't like that. There's an investment aspect to it. And the reason there is an investment aspect to it is, if you will imagine with me a police department with 1,000 employees who make an average of $70,000 per year. If 10 people per year have been retiring for the past 25 years, there are 250 retirees to pay pensions to. The standard pension rate is half of what you made when you retired, plus a COLA, but let's ignore that. So let's say that's $35,000 a year. The total liability of the pension fund is $8.75 million per year. They have to pay out that much money each year. So let's say that the 1,000 employees currently working are each paying 6% of their salary into the pension fund, and that's pretty standard. That's $4.5 million per year. So a little under half the total liability of the pension fund is being, around about half of the pension fund is being funded through a pay-go system, if that's what they're using. They have to make up that money somehow.
And I'm assuming that they're making up this money through investments in public companies, in private equity firms, in other sorts of vehicles for making money.
Exactly. So in the 70s and 80s, you might kind of look around at the political environment and say, well, there's still a party of labor in the United States. How is it that we are letting this kind of sucking away of money into the financial sector be permitted? And a reason that this was allowed to happen in the first place was that it was benefiting labor. It was benefiting laborers. It was benefiting employees as they retired. So this really changes the landscape of corporate finance and corporate funding generally. Things that used to be considered assets, particularly employees, used to consider an employee an asset. Employees become treated like liabilities when shareholder value is prioritized. So that's what we're doing.
Because this structure that was originally intended to benefit employees,
yes,
has since inverted itself.
Yes.
To be a situation where now it is causing the employees not to be seen as an asset, but as a burden, as a liability.
Absolutely. And something that's really interesting about this period in time is this is when you start to see layoffs detached from the business cycle. We just went through some pretty significant layoffs in tech. And it's not like Google is making less money all of a sudden and needs to lay people off, right? It is that there is an idea that compensation is getting too high, or you have staffed up too many employees and you are right-sizing your business. That doesn't have anything to do with how much money a corporation is making. It has to do with how much they're spending on labor relative to their profits, and if they think they can push those salaries down.
I see. So basically what we're seeing is like the business could do more. They could pay higher salaries. They could use, I don't know, maybe to use an example from not the tech sector, like a home building company or a clothing manufacturer. They could use sustainably sourced materials, but that would go against how much money they're going to be able to deliver to the shareholders, because that's more expensive.
Or another example, Chipotle announced a couple of weeks ago they're increasing their prices by like 4% or something. And the internet's in an uproar naturally and says, well, they just paid dividends to their shareholders. They don't need more money. They could just not pay the dividends. No, not under our current legal scheme. We understand what we're doing. The boards of directors and officers are deciding to make these choices where they are maximizing shareholder value because, as you said earlier, they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders.
And it also seems that like this model of like very quick, like quarterly profit statements, basically, it holds companies back from doing things that they might think would be good for them long term, but which would not be profitable in the immediate term.
Exactly. It is all about this issue of fiduciary obligation. So for folks who don't know what a fiduciary is or what fiduciary obligations are, let me take you through an example using a financial planner. So let's say your parents are at the point where they're retired and they have, been saving money for retirement, and they go to see a financial planner to make sure that they are able to take the money that they have, invest it wisely, and live for the rest of their lives on that money without having to return to the workforce. That's most people's goal when they retire, right? They have
Seems reasonable. Seems reasonable.
So they have a financial planner. And that financial planner may or may not be a fiduciary, depending on that person's different certifications and where they work. If the financial planner is, going about her day, doing her business, and she gets a call from a friend of a friend who works at a large investment brokerage. And that friend of a friend says, hey, we have this new financial product that we are looking at selling. It bundles together a bunch of different products, including shares of mortgages for folks who are kind of questionable credit investments.
I wonder what this could be in reference to.
I wonder what this could be in reference to. It has a number of products in it. But it does have higher risk than a bundle of securities that doesn't have these higher risk mortgages in it. And we know it's high risk or higher risk than your other options. And we know it may be harder for you to convince an individual to take on this investment as part of their portfolio. So because it's going to be more difficult for you to sell, we are willing to pay you an additional cut for every share of these types of investments you sell for us. For every person you get invested in this product, we will pay you an additional percentage on top of the percentage that you already get for managing that person's portfolio. And so this financial planner, who is planning for your parents, somebody your parents' age who are retired, she has a choice. She can recommend that product or not. And in the case of some already retired folks, she knows that they probably prefer a lower risk portfolio. But she's balancing their interests against her own interests in making that additional financial benefit, getting that extra cut for selling that product. If she is a fiduciary, what she needs to do is prioritize their interests. And in this case, that is probably not selling them that product. If she is not a fiduciary, she may recommend, this is a slightly riskier thing, but I think you should still do it, and then not need to disclose that she's getting an extra cut or just make the recommendation in the first place.
So basically the idea is that a fiduciary has a legal obligation to put their investors, their customers' well-being, best interests over their own.
Exactly.
And if you are not a fiduciary, you do not have that legal duty.
Exactly. So I am giving the most generous version of what a fiduciary is meant to be doing. So we can kind of see where this would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
A situation in which this legal structure makes sense. This is your parents' retirement and their ability to not have to return to the workplace in their 70s to make extra money because their investments fell through. But consider that at a corporate level. If you can pay your employees more, or use sustainably farmed cotton, or not pollute, or you can give the money you would have spent on those things to your shareholders in the form of a dividend, you must give that money to shareholders. This is the doctrine of shareholder primacy.
Not great.
Yep.
Sounds not great.
Sounds not great. Does not sound amazing.
Okay, so Megan, this is not amazing, right? There must be ways to get around this, stop this, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, there are a couple of different ways to get around this. I will say, while this is not the general point of this episode, this is why regulation is so important.
Right.
Proponents of the free market argue that if the public demands something of corporations, at least one corporation in the market will offer it because they see that a profit can be made by differentiating themselves. This, again, to bring it back to Chipotle, you could probably make more money offering frozen chicken in your burrito bowls, but they like to talk about our ingredients have never been frozen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a market for that. Absolutely. People like that marketing. But we can see that it's not necessarily true across the board. There is a risk to say that you will forego a cost-saving measure in hopes that you can recover costs and make the same profit you otherwise would have.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do not match that anticipated profit, you're harming your shareholders' financial position. And if you harm the shareholders, they can sue you under certain circumstances. Corporations have to be forced to not pollute, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Because they will, if they have the option, take the more risk-averse path and choose to pollute to maximize profit to their shareholders.
I see. So yeah, that makes sense. Seems reasonable.
Yes.
But even within that framework, that's still like they'd still be legally obligated to do other things that prioritize their shareholders. So maybe to the back half of this episode, maybe we should take a bit of a break here.
I think we should, yeah.
How do we? Well, I guess we'll come back and we'll talk about embracing public benefits corporations.
Yeah,
which
this is not the only way to do things. The shareholder primacy is not the only way to do things, and some states have already come up with a way to get around it. Corporations respond to legal incentives, so let's make the legal incentive structure permit something different than what it currently does.
All right, sounds good. We'll take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about it.
Excellent.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When Megan and I left you, we were talking about how this doctrine of shareholder primacy, this theory of corporate governance, that the first thing you ought to do, first and foremost, your legal obligation is to your shareholders, causes a bunch of negative consequences. It makes, employees seen as liabilities rather than assets. It forces corporations to do things that maybe they would not otherwise do, not plan for the long term, not pollute, not use sustainable materials, all in the service of delivering the highest value to the people that own parts of the corporation. And I think we need to emphasize this very strongly, that these corporations are in many cases legally obligated to follow this, both at the state level as well as sort of like within their articles of incorporation, right? Like the contract that they make with shareholders, right? Basically. But aside from regulation and forcing businesses not to do the terrible things that might make their shareholders more money, but are terrible for the country and the public writ large, what are the other things we can do here? And that is embracing the public benefit corporation, which I will readily admit I am much less familiar with than I am with sort of the theory of shareholder primacy. So, Megan, why don't you help us out here? What exactly are public benefit corporations?
What is this thing?
Yeah, what is this thing?
Let's start just generally with a fact of how business law works. Corporate structures are created by law. There is not some sort of natural structure for a corporation. All of this is created by ideas, and then by law, and they're created at the state level. Each corporation that you interact with is incorporated in a state. A lot of times it's Delaware, so it may feel like everybody's using the same law and, oh, isn't it federal? No, it's state law. And you are limited by the types of corporate forms that are allowed by your state's law, the law of the state that you choose to incorporate in. Quick note, when I say corporate form, that's the term for business structure. It's not a form that you're filling out. Usually you have to fill out forms to pick a corporate form, but there are about 36 states and DC that allow you to choose the legal entity type of public benefit corporation. A public benefit corporation is a for-profit company, and it specifies, however, that profit is not the only goal of the corporation. Mm-hmm. State corporate law then specifies what other considerations in addition to profit the directors must consider. Generally, they are the employees, customers, the community, and the environment.
Okay.
So I want to note at this point, I think people may be familiar with the idea of a B Corp.
Is that the same thing, or is that not the same thing?
It is not the same thing. You often see the little logo. I think it's like a hexagon or an octagon with a B
a little B in it. Yeah.
That's not the same thing. A B Corp is a certification offered by the private entity B Lab.
Mm-hmm.
And this certifies that businesses are meeting certain social and environmental standards. It's more of a point about marketing than about business law or management. You can be a B Corp and not have the same legal structure or the same permissions, essentially, to prioritize employees, customers, community, and environment. Something I want to call it Athleta, the athleisure brand, whose pants I'm currently wearing. They're a B Corp.
Okay.
They're owned by the Gap, Banana Republic, Old Navy, same company. Only Athleta is B Corp certified. And I did not go and take a look at this business structure of the entire corporate entity. I would be surprised to find out that their higher level corporate structure is a certified public benefit company.
Mm-hmm.
I would be very surprised to find that out. Just because clothing companies generally have a hard time being profitable and being corporations that meet those same sorts of environmental employee standards.
Right.
So,
which is a little disappointing, broadly speaking.
Yeah. No, but the point that I'm making with this is you can be a B Corp without being a public benefit corporation, and you can be a public benefit corporation without being a B Corp.
I see.
You know, and I don't want to impugn the Gap. I don't know for sure what any of their business practices are, but it's a distinction between a corporate form and a certification that any business can achieve. We could, if we had an LLC, we could go and get B Corp certification for our podcast.
Well, I like to think we're very considerate of the environment and of people and of our employees. Yes, you and I. we treat ourselves very well.
Yes. So a B Corp and a public benefit corporation are not necessarily the same thing. I am proposing as a solution that states that do not already offer a public benefit corporate form adopt legislation that will create it. I'm further advocating that states offer tax incentives for the adoption of such corporate form.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean, you say there are 36 states that allow it, but like, I mean, what are some do we have examples of some of these companies? Like, how do they differ from because I guess if we're saying like these public benefit corporations maybe they're able to care about other things, right? Are there like ones that you know of that are like broadly considered, like I guess like a company like Patagonia, maybe, right? Like, is Patagonia one of these or I don't know, there's like Kickstarter or something, or what are some ones that are like talk about being employee owned? Isn't like King Arthur Flour like an employee? Like, I'm thinking of brands that I like.
Yeah, brands that you like. Yeah, Patagonia is one. Kickstarter is one. Ben and Jerry's is one.
Ben and Jerry's. Okay, good. Good
King
example.
Arthur Flour, Warby Parker.
The glasses people?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me see. Like, let's see what else we can come up with. I think Bob's Red Mill is another one. I'm not 100% sure about that. But yeah, if you see a corporation that is advertising itself as employee owned, usually you're going to find that sort of corporate structure.
I looked this up for myself. Blue Sky. Find me on Blue Sky, by the way.
Oh, okay.
They apparently are certified public. Okay.
Yeah.
Allbirds. All right. Interesting. Okay.
There are some that I was expecting on here that aren't on here.
Probably not an exhaustive list that we're looking at.
I would imagine not. But a number of companies that make their reputation by, environmental sensitivity, et cetera. Things like The Honest Company, Thrive Market, Seventh Generation, which is another sustainable cleaning product company.
Okay.
So that sort of thing.
What I'm hearing thus far is that even if maybe some of the corporations that we might expect to be on the list aren't on the list, it doesn't seem like there are any evil companies here, basically.
No, it's hard to be evil and be a public benefit corporation. And I don't know how it would work necessarily. Like, you could try to be evil, but I think you would be somewhat stymied by your obligation. You are obligated then to act on behalf of the environment, on behalf of the community, on behalf of your employees, not just your shareholders. So it creates a incentive structure for corporations to behave in ways I think we would prefer they behave. We at the top of the episode talked about how frustrated we are with corporations that are not treating consumers and customers as if efficiency for them matters as much as efficiency for the company. But it could be not just kind of an psychic benefit for people to not be quite so frustrated 100% of the time. You could also just genuinely improve the environment, your community, and it could also cost less in taxes if you are in a community that has more of these corporations in it. Earlier, I mentioned offering tax incentives for corporations to choose this corporate form as opposed to just a public, a C Corp is the standard corporate form. If you have less pressure to cut salaries and benefits, you have higher salaries and benefits and less reliance on public support, right? One of the greatest recipients of government welfare is the corporation Walmart. Because you are subsidizing their employees in the form of TAMF, food stamps.
Because they have so many employees, and so many of them are paid quite low wages.
Low. Yes, exactly, for so few hours.
And the reason that Walmart is able to still have those employees is because the government fills in the gaps, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And the reason, perhaps one of the reasons at least, why Walmart does pay these workers such low wages is because they're trying to get money for their shareholders, right? So this makes a good deal of sense to me. I'm sort of putting together these what these public benefit corporations are and how they work.
You could also say the same thing about if you have less pressure to sidestep environmental regulations, you'll have less sidestepping of environmental regulations and less public money spent on enforcement and cleanup or mitigation if necessary in terms of public health interventions. There are any number of ways that you can see this would be a benefit to public finance. If corporations don't feel incentivized to be as bad an actor as they can get away with in order to benefit their shareholders.
Yeah, it seems like to a greater or larger extent, a lot of sort of the ways that the government has to step in to fill the gaps left by corporations acting in this sort of monomaniacal pursuit of profit for their shareholders wouldn't be as necessary in this instance, or at least maybe even if they were still necessary, right? They would be able to more effectively actually propel people forward and offer a real social safety net rather than this is the support of last resort. Right. This is the only thing that we have that keeps you from being destitute, even if you're employed and have a job at one of these corporations.
Absolutely. I think also, even without new corporate forms, we might also be able to weaken the laws that prioritize shareholder interest in this way.
We don't necessarily have to go all the way to you must prioritize the community, your employees, the environment. We would prefer that companies do this, obviously, right?
That would be good, yeah.
But many companies won't, even if you provide these tax incentives. The board of directors, after all made up of shareholders, right, isn't going to suddenly transform themselves into a public benefit corporation, most likely, right? So loosening the requirements that management teams have to do this, have to do this pursuit of value for their shareholders against all else, right? Allows and this is sort of a 2010s thing, and a lot of it was marketing, but allows corporations to actually maybe a little bit more fully embrace corporate social responsibility as more than just a marketing tactic to get millennials to buy their products because they believe that millennials are like conscientious consumers.
Yeah, absolutely. Or this could come in the form of strengthening the business judgment rule, which is, again, nitty gritty, weedsy lawyer stuff. But it kind of creates a wall between lawsuits and your corporate directors. And most of the time, I will say most of the time, shareholders aren't really able to get through that wall and say that you weren't maximizing shareholder value. They are able to do that during some sort of leadership transition. And so the boogeyman for these executives then is, we're going to have a leadership transition because they're mad at us because our profits are falling. And then they're going to be able to pierce that veil created by the business judgment rule. If we're strengthening the business judgment rule and saying it was reasonable, even during XYZ time, this was a reasonable business strategy. There was a possibility. Here's the research that was provided. This is why we thought this was going to work. We weren't deliberately or maliciously trying to hurt your profits, etc. If there is some sort of structure or way, I'm getting out of my area of the law a little bit here. If there is some sort of way to enhance or strengthen that rule, and that could come in the form of case law, and we're down on the Supreme Court on this podcast, but that could come in the form of case law as well as actual legislative law to kind of prioritize the ability to try different things in terms of businesses enhancing their corporate responsibility as a marketing ploy, if that's how you have to sell it, to create different options in the marketplace for consumers who want to prioritize different things in their purchasing.
Yeah. It also seems to me that part of this is like, even today, a lot of the money in these systems is retirement, right? A lot of it is people making investments, like individual people go into like Charles Schwab or Robinhood or Vanguard or any of these other sort of like broker, big like fund managers, right? That get all of this money together. Seems like we need actual sort of real social insurance in a way that supports retirees a little bit better, so that they aren't so that this like modern use case of all of this shareholder value, which is, as we talked about earlier, not really to spread risk around anymore, but instead to insulate old people from risk in their later years.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. It's about generating wealth, and just in the same way that owning a house became a wealth generation strategy and not about providing shelter for people. Investment has stopped being about that risk sharing and has started to be more about wealth generation. And I think we can see that both have yielded bad outcomes. Both are making things worse. So how do we make it work so that people aren't thinking of, just as they aren't thinking about their house as a wealth generation strategy necessarily, how do we start thinking about investment in corporations as something other than a wealth generation strategy for individuals? And I think a more robust form of old age insurance is probably a way to go on that. And that is why I actually do like that Social Security is pay-go. As risky as it seems at any time, especially given our demographic challenges, the idea that you're not reliant on the market to generate that kind of wealth in that way frees you and frees the government in this case from having to incentivize growth at the expense of every other concern that we have.
It also seems that offering more of these avenues, and like reconceptualizing how we think about like investment, right, is bringing back investment to actually do things, right? Because it seems like a lot of the money that gets invested in these corporations nowadays doesn't necessarily go to helping those corporations do new cool things that like actually like advance like science or products or anything like that. Like there's no, like, it seems like innovation has slowed down over the last 40, 50 years or whatever. And, perhaps part of that is that, well, we're taking like this money that's being spent on all of these shares isn't like directly going back into the company's pockets, right? It's not being used to make things.
Absolutely. And that's that transition that we were talking about earlier from that kind of retain and reinvest model into the shareholder primacy model. If you have money left over, you're not spending it on necessarily on R&D, research and development. You're not buying new, better equipment or developing new, better equipment. You are putting that money back into your shareholders' pockets because that's what you think you have to do.
And then they're using that money to just put back into the market and have it do its own thing again.
Yeah, it's a perpetual wealth generation machine. And if that's all you want out of your society, great, that is the system that we have. But if you want other things out of your society, we need to start thinking about how we use the resources that we have to generate those other benefits rather than focusing solely on the creation of wealth for the sake of the creation of wealth.
Yeah, if you want companies to do things other than make money, if you want them to do useful things, if you want them to invent new products, right, that like genuinely do, I think, make people's lives better in many cases, right? Like the sort of medical technology that we have nowadays, the more comfortable mattresses than we used to have, right? Like you come up with your favorite example, right? Like someone made your laptop, somebody made the monitor that you're using, someone invented the, stainless steel pans that you use in your kitchen to make the stuff that you like, right? And people are trying, or should be trying, to make continually better versions of those things. And right now, the way that corporate structure is organized, I think actively disincentivizes that kind of investment in innovation.
Or even risk taking generally. We have taken something that was designed to help people take risk and turned it into something that makes people risk averse. And that is not what we want to be doing going forward.
Absolutely not. Absolutely. We do not want to be doing that going forward. So, with that in mind, I hopefully, I don't know that it took much convincing. It didn't take me, didn't take much convincing for me. Maybe it took a little more convincing for the audience. But we hope that throughout the course of this episode, we've convinced you to reject shareholder primacy and embrace the public benefit corporation. But until then, I have been Clayton Becker.
I've been Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys on the next one.